Hey everybody, welcome back to Men Need to Be Heard. It's Dan, and I've got another exciting show for you. I have a returning guest. My guest today is Phil Mitchell. He was on 3-4 months ago, and I'm excited because he's coming back to talk about his new book that he has out, which is, hold on, I gotta get my paper in front of me so I say the whole thing right. The Sexual Abuse of Boys and Men, Creating an Approach for Neglected Victims, which I think is one of the most important topics that we need to discuss as a society. So I wanted to invite Phil to come back on, talk about the book, and talk about the issues. So let me bring him on. Hello, Mr. Phil. How are you today?
Hello. Yes, I'm good. Thank you. Thanks for having me back.
I am so glad you are coming back on. I did. Let's just take a moment here, real quick, and have you introduce yourself to the audience. For those that may not have seen the prior podcast, which, by the way, I will put a link to down in the show notes for those of you listening, so you can go check that one out because that one's an awesome podcast. This one's going to be better, though.
No pressure.
All right, no pressure at all on you, Phil. All right, Phil, why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
So I'm Phil Mitchell. So for about 19 years now, I have been working with boys and men who have experienced sexual abuse, either as children, adults, or both. And I've done that as a volunteer, as a project coordinator of the Child Sexual Exploitation Service for boys for 9 years, as a therapist, in lots of different sort of settings, if you like. That work, interestingly, I didn't expect it would, but has led me into working with other boys and men abused in different ways that isn't sexual abuse. So false allegations of abuse, other false allegations, paternity fraud, sometimes forced fatherhood. So things that are what some might call controversial. I don't think they should be. They're just issues that affect boys and men, and we need to hear them and listen to that. And I also deliver training on working with boys and men, on working with sexually abused boys and men. And I also do things like this, and I also supervise qualified and trainee practitioners who are counsellors or youth workers or other practitioners working with abused boys or other vulnerable adults as well. And as I say, I've been doing that for uh, well, in lots of different ways, part time, full time, for just over 19 years now. So I guess that's about me.
That's a mouthful, my friend. And I
Yes.
will tell you, I follow Phil on Twitter or X. Sorry, we got to call it X now. I'll never call it X. It's always going to be Twitter. And he shares a lot of information on there. I strongly encourage you to follow him there. And you also kind of have done seminars and that type of stuff. I've seen things where you go in and do workshops, that type of thing. So you're trying to educate people. And I think it's safe to say that's the main purpose of this book is to educate people.
Yeah. Ultimately, I wanted to, get to be an old man and look back on my life and think, what am I going to leave behind? I don't have any children. I have no interest in having children. It's not for me. And I thought, what do I leave behind? I thought, there's a book. That book is out there now, and that's my legacy, if you like. And also, I had a list of things I wanted to achieve before I reached certain ages, and one of them was write a book. And so there was all the sort of personal reasons for doing it as well, and I wanted to feel that I'd achieved something just for me. I don't often people sometimes describe me as an academic. I'm absolutely not an academic. I'm the least academic person you will ever meet. I'm really not an academic, but people describe me as that. But I thought, well, you know what? I'd really like to write a book and something about that I'm passionate about. But you're right. The one of the points, the main point of the book, is to educate people, but it's about educating them, hopefully not in a patronizing way. That's not something I wanted to do, but maybe in a way that hasn't been done before, in a way that encourages people to see different perspectives to what the mainstream media might put out there.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, that one of the main points was definitely to educate.
Yeah, it's interesting that we're very much alike in some ways because I've written books in the fitness world. I'm actually in the process of writing three in this particular space. It's finding the time. So, amen to you for getting it done because I've got chapters going in all three right now, so I can relate to the experience. But it does leave a legacy for you. And what I want to say to people is you need to go get the book and read it, because the information in there is, it will blow your mind. It is contrary to the narrative that's out there in many ways. I think one of the issues, and we'll kind of dive into some of this, is that society, I'm going to use the term society, really doesn't understand the extent of the problem, I don't think. Full disclaimer for anyone that has never watched my podcast or doesn't know, I am a victim of a sexual assault at 13 that went on for a while by a 35-year-old woman. So I have some passion in this interest, or in this area, to raise awareness that the boys go through this stuff. And, the belief that, and I think, Phil, you'll back me on this, the majority of society has, oh, he must have enjoyed it, or I wish that happened to me. And they're the ones that haven't been through it. It's affecting me even now at 60. Although I've made my peace with it, I've come to terms with it, but I can't honestly say that it doesn't still affect me in some way. What have you seen along those lines?
Well, yeah, I would agree with you as well. I think what I've seen, I've seen a lot. It's a big question, really. I think what I've kind of seen is, to echo what you said, this belief, this myth that, well, if a boy has what should we call it, a sexual encounter, a sexual experience with an older woman, that it's not abuse. And I think that often kind of leaks into when these boys become men. And there are two things that I often hear online in the real world, from boys and men that I've worked with, from the parents of boys and men that I've worked with, and they go, it's not abuse if the boy/man, it's not abuse if he wanted it to happen, enjoyed it, and not abuse. I'm trying to just remember. Yes, it's not abuse if he wanted it, if he enjoyed it, and I think there's a third one. It's just gone out of my mind. And if the perpetrator, if they're good looking involved. So ultimately, what I hear is, if you have a 14-year-old boy and he ends up in what we might call a sexual encounter with an attractive 30-year-old woman, they say it's not abuse because he wanted it, he enjoyed it, and they're both, or the woman is good looking. To which you just simply have to respond by saying, so if that was a 14-year-old girl having a sexual encounter with a good-looking 30-year-old man, and she enjoyed that encounter and she wanted it to happen, that's not abuse.
Right.
And you get the ideology and all the bias comes out, and I've gone, actually what you're saying is, it's different when the genders are different. And there are differences, it's certainly in perception, but actually it's still abuse. The law in that sense does not discriminate. I think what's really interesting, when I was running a service that worked with sexually abused boys, or boys who were deemed to be at risk of experiencing sexual abuse, you would have social workers, youth workers, teachers, educational staff, police, lots of different people sitting around this table, and we'd all be talking about these girls, and we're worried about these girls, and they're going missing, they're coming home late, they've come home with, I don't know, a bag of weed, or back then it was like a new iPod or a new mobile phone, and they're secretive about how they found it. They're bunking off school, they've been seen in town with this older guy, and they've been very secretive about who this guy is. Well, a lot of those behaviours or indicators are signs that girl might be being groomed and sexually exploited. Mm-hmm. And so professionals would go, right, we need to find out more, police need to do that, social care needs to do that, let's have a safeguarding meeting and find out more. But then you would hear professionals talking about a boy, and a boy or a number of boys would be in similar, and in some cases identical situations to the girl that I've just mentioned. But the risk of child sexual abuse / exploitation wouldn't either be ignored, not considered, or minimised. At which point I would be in this meeting, and my staff at the time would say, if every time we had every time Phil said, what would you think if this girl was a boy or this boy was a girl, we'd be millionaires, because it's all I ever said. Putting that challenge across often fell on deaf ears. People would look at each other in the awkward silence. And what we were saying was, well, hang on a minute. You're saying a girl displays these behaviours. You're concerned she might be being sexually exploited. A boy's displaying them. you're less concerned. And if the adult of concern that the boy was hanging around with was a woman, well, then the concern would go down and down and down even more.
Mm-hmm.
At which point we would have to say this is just absolute bias. Now, thankfully, John Barry and Martin Seeger, chartered psychologists who wrote the Palgrave Handbook of Male Psychology and Mental Health, came up with the psychological concept of gamma bias, where we simultaneously minimize and magnify gender differences. And that's what I was seeing. So, go back 15 years, I wish that concept was around then, because I would have been able to say this is gamma bias, but that it didn't sort of exist, or we didn't know about it. But in answer to your question, and I think I've waffled on and diverted away, but in answer to your question, I see all of these problems. I did see all of these problems. I still see them now with boys and men I'm working with colleagues that I speak to, with people that I supervise, people when I deliver training. People come up to me in the break and say, this is happening. We know that, we hear this, we see this. There's all of these problems. And I think, as I've said before, when it comes to the abuse of boys and men, not just sexual abuse, but any sort of harm and abuse, well, what happens is women are protected, men are neglected. And that's why I came up with the subheading for the title of my book, which was Creating an Approach for Neglected Victims, because I think they are neglected victims. They are absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt, the victims that are neglected. I should say, I'm not saying girls and women have got it easy. I'm not saying that female victims have got it all. I think that goes without saying, but sometimes you have to say it to just make
you have to play the old, you can say anything you want about a man or a boy, and you don't have to put a caveat in. But if you bring up the other side, you always have to put that caveat in. Well, there's exceptions, or this, a couple things that kind of came through my mind as you were talking about that. You were talking about like how people view it. One thing that I'm seeing a lot of lately online is a discussion about the biological response. So if the boy I was 13. If you're a man, you know how your body is at 13. It's going to respond to the wind blowing by, okay? If I may put it that way. And they then use that as justification that, no, he wasn't sexually assaulted because he got erect. And my counter to that is similar to what you do, is going, I have talked with many, unfortunately, female rape victims, and they will tell you their vagina got wet. I've talked with ones that have had orgasms during it. It's simply biological response. And when you say that about a woman, they react and go, well, that can't be true. They disbelief and all that. But then the other side of it is they cannot fathom making that connection that it's just a biological response for boys. Have you run into that yourself? I've seen a lot more lately online.
Yeah, absolutely loads. I think, and it's really interesting. I think we're leaning towards psychoeducation here, where it's about explaining the science, the biology to people, and what the data says, what the facts say. And I think, to some degree, I can understand why people might think, oh, someone got an erection, that means they enjoyed it and they wanted it and they consented. Well, I can see why some people might think that, because we associate an erection generally with sex that you want and enjoy and all of that sort of stuff and so on. But again, it's not as simple as that. And if we look at what I can't remember the name of the organization. I think it's the Association of Urology in North America. I can't remember. It's basically a massive urology organization. The information they share is pretty clear. So let's think about it. Dead bodies can get an erection. Does that mean they want to have sex?
That's a great point you just made there, Phil, because it's true. It does happen.
Yeah. Babies, fetuses in the womb can get an erection. Does that mean they want to have sex? When you're asleep, you can get an erection. Does that mean you want to have sex? And so again, I think what we have to say is the presence of an erection alone is not proof that you want sex, you need it, you're going to enjoy it, and so on. As you've quite rightly said, it's a physical response. Now, I learned a lot from a very short TED talk by, I think her name is Emily Nagoski, and she talks about something called arousal non-concordance, where your body seems and appears to be aroused, and physically ready for sex. But that doesn't mean you want to have sex. And I think, again, it's that, as you've said, especially when you're going through puberty and teenage and
Oh
so on, your
yeah.
body will respond to all sorts of things. But I often say to people when I'm delivering my training on working with male victims and things, I say, I can go outside and I can spend hours, building up a tent, putting up a tent and all that. It doesn't mean I want to go camping.
Yeah.
And again, there's something there about, we're making assumptions, and it's not, your penis doesn't tell you that you want to have sex. You tell that your penis that you want to have sex. And just because your penis is ready physically to have sex, it doesn't mean you want to do that. And
Right.
one of the things in my book I talk about this in the book. I talk about the fight or flight response. And so when you panic, and it's a bit of an over the top panicky response to whatever's going on, it might be that you've got a job interview, you're going to speak on stage, and you start to panic. Your heart starts beating, blood's been pumping around your body, your brain is getting your body ready to fight for your life or run for your life, but you don't actually end up fighting for your life or running for your life. So just because you are physically, your heart's beating really, really fast, your brain's saying to your body, move, 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 fight something or run from something, yeah, you're now ready to fight or run. But many people don't. So just because you're ready to do it, or physically in a position to do it, doesn't mean you will do it or that you want to do it. And so that, I think that's the thing, this is what it all boils down to. So we need education, but it is really interesting because people, but men and women, they all think, oh, well, if you got aroused, like if someone's vagina got wet, if someone got an erect penis, it means, well, they wanted it and they enjoyed it. No, it doesn't. It actually means it's a physical, biological response. There are plenty of people that where they, you can be on the bus, if you're on the crowded bus and you're squeezing past everybody to get to the front of the bus, and you kind of brush past this 70-year-old pensioner that's and you get an erection. It doesn't mean you want to have sex with that pensioner. Maybe you do, it depends what you're into, I don't know, but I think it doesn't mean that. It means your body is physically responding.
Yeah.
A physical response to external stimulus is not enough to say you want it and you enjoy it.
It's just interesting to me how they will stick to that as their justification to dismiss the male victim. And I think in some ways it reflects in the law also. Now, UK law is different than US law, but in some states in the US, MTP, made to penetrate, is the definition of rape. If, in other words, you have to penetrate in order for it to be rape. And, that law, in my opinion, is somewhat in place because of this belief that, if he got erect, that's what he wanted sex. So, what are your thoughts on that? Like, how do the laws look at it?
Well, I always get a bit confused with the law in the States, to be honest, because people tell me different things, and people who seem quite credible tell me conflicting things. And there's the whole, well, the FBI.
Well,
They have
yeah.
their.
So I think I can answer that a little bit for you, Phil, in the
Okay.
sense that when you're talking to people in the United States, it's more based on state law. There's not really federal law on this. So in the UK, you're one big state, so to speak, right? You have different counties and shires, as I call them.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's different. The laws in the UK, and I think Canada would apply also, are more national laws, if you will. Whereas in
Right.
the
Okay.
States, every state can be different. So a law that, say, where I am in North Carolina, defines rape as this, the state of Oregon may have something different. The state of New York may have something different. Now, does that mean they're entirely different? No, they can all be variations off of it. So I think that might be where some of the confusion comes in. And I could certainly understand why it would be. We're like, what? This guy said this guy said that, But I think in looking at some of the laws, because I went and looked at some of the statutes, and the out, as I hate to put it that way, that they use to say that women can't be rapists is essentially underneath the wording, he got erect, and that's a problem. I don't know what is UK law. I'm not sure myself.
So, I mean, so we refer to the 2003 Sexual Offences Act, and Section 1 of the Act is rape. And it defines rape, and anybody listening to this, please don't criticize me because I might not get it exactly spot on and perfect. In fact, I probably won't. It's all about when a penis enters the mouth, anus, or vagina of a victim. And so, biologically, it's basically saying that actually it is males, biological males, they're the ones that can commit rape, whereas biological females cannot. Now, there is something there where if a female, if she aids a man in that rape, like holds the victim down or is involved somehow, she can also be charged with that rape and sort of assisting, if that's the right word to use. But she cannot commit the physical act herself because the law says you can't. And it's really interesting. I don't agree with it at all, and I think it's astounding. I think that rape should be reworded, and there have been cases put out there to say we should reword it so it means that it can be perpetrated by men and women rather than just men. However, you can imagine what happens. Certain groups of people come out screaming, shouting, no, that's terrible, we don't want that, and no, rape is one of these things where it's something a man does to a woman. Well, yeah, because that's how it's been worded in law. Right. But if we talk about abuse and sexual assaults and abuse, then men can do it to women, women do it to men, women do it to women, men can do it to men. And Siobhan Weir from the University of Lancaster did some research on forced to penetrate. And the CDC, as I'm sure you'll know, they had some very interesting data on forced to penetrate. And I do write about it in I think it's chapter 2 of my book about legislation and sort of law. It really focuses on UK law because that's kind of where I am. I can cover everything, and I don't know everything, of course. But it's about kind of saying, when a man or a boy, if a female perpetrator manipulates him and forces him to penetrate her, that cannot legally be called rape. It is called, it would be sexual assault or assault by penetration. Now, some people will say, does it really matter? And I would say, yes, it does for many reasons. 2 strong ones come to mind. One, the minimum sentence for rape is higher than the minimum sentence for sexual assault and assault by penetration. So there's sentencing guidelines disparity, which affects things. And ultimately, a man who has been forced to penetrate his female perpetrator cannot legally refer to her as a rapist. And that has massive impacts for some victims because they think there's massive injustice, huge inequality, and it kind of links to that myth that, well, as you said, if I got erect, it means nothing. I was saying no, I said get off. I've now been, I've been forced into fatherhood. I got various sexually transmitted infections. I feel like my masculinity and my confidence has been brought into question now. I'm scared of saying something because she might falsely accuse me of something, and if she does, then the police are clearly going to believe her and not me. Are people going to laugh at me because I should have just enjoyed it because men always want sex, which is a ridiculous myth. Plenty of guys just want to sit down, have a cuppa and relax.
Yep.
And so there's all of this, and I think my view, and some people don't agree with this, but I think if they can or won't change the offence of rape, and they can or won't reword it in a way that means males and females can perpetrate it, then I think what would be useful for us to see is, can we have maybe an offence of forced to penetrate? So UK Sexual Offences Act does not have that offence. They will say it's covered under maybe assault by penetration or sexual assault, but I think something about forced to penetrate is a very powerful wording, and I think it gives a clear message. And I think this is where I think the CDC are a little bit ahead of where we are in the UK. And so I can't remember the exact data, but I think for 3 or 4 years in a row, the number of men who have been estimated to have been forced to penetrate was very similar to the number of women who disclosed being raped. And in some years, the number of men, and these are estimates, by the way, I should add, the number of men estimated to have been forced to penetrate was higher than the number of women who had been
Yeah, I've seen
raped.
similar data on that. Yeah,
Yeah.
and what's interesting too about what you're talking about is when you look at it from the back end. So if you're going to define it in a certain way, the thing that they'll do then is, in my opinion, part of the reason they do it is it throws the statistics off, right? So you and I'm sure you've seen it on Twitter and other places where they'll say, well, 99% of rapes are committed by men. Well, yes, because that's what the law says. But
Yeah.
it's not just that, it's that those statistics then become what's used to generate funding for victims or help for victims.
Yeah.
So again, I'm speaking for the US. I'm going to bet the UK is the same. There's little to no funding for male victims because, well, men don't get raped. You
Yeah.
know, it's it becomes almost a self-fulfilling prophecy that just kind of goes in a circle. Well, men don't get raped, so we don't need to get any funding, but we're going to keep the laws this way. And then you start talking about changing the laws, then it goes in reverse. Well, there's no need to change the laws because the stats show blah blah blah. And I think it leaves the victims, male victims, just kind of out there, right? And that's what I went through. There was no help for me. Talking about my experience, I remained quiet for a number of years. I was probably 18. It happened at 13 and 14 because it was over a period of time. I didn't say anything to anybody until I was over 18 because I was so ashamed of it, right? I didn't know how to handle it. I didn't know how to process it. It was not something I wanted, but I knew if I, even at that age, I knew if I said didn't want it, they wouldn't believe me. They would say, "Oh, you did want it." And ultimately, when I did go to the police about it, that's exactly what they said to me, verbatim. They wouldn't even take a report, you know.
Yeah.
And I think again, it falls back into that whole overall thing where the definition does need to be tightened, and it may be
Yes.
what you're talking about. You made an interesting point that kind of hit home with me, which is I always refer to mine as a sexual assault, but it was a
Mm.
rape.
Mm.
Now you really hit me with that one because I'm like, wait a minute, he's right. Do you see that with guys? Do we? I don't want to say miscategorize. I don't know what the term I want to use is where we don't
Well,
call it rape.
I think it's the wording and the language matters so much. It really does, and it's one of the reasons why some male victims don't engage with surveys and research projects or official bodies collecting data. The language that is used can be very victim focused, which is I get and makes sense, but sometimes we need to use different language to make it more accessible to boys and men. And that's what I was saying, because like I say, the Crime in England and Wales survey that's used over here specifically does not ask, have you ever been forced to penetrate? Doesn't ask that question. But the I can never remember, the National Intimate Partner Sexual Violence Survey linked to the CDC, it does ask that question.
Mm-hmm.
And I suspect that that's a part of why the America gets the data it does, because the language is easy to understand. It's there. And I do wonder, what would the data show if we asked that question? And is there a reluctance for us to ask the question because we don't want to present the data because it challenges this rigid narrative of male perpetrator, female victim, and we can't have that. And so maybe that's why they don't ask the question. Who knows?
Yeah.
But I think, yes, coming back to your point, I think the problem that you have is that it's competing for victimhood, which is not healthy in any part of the world. Acknowledge victimhood, deal with it, overcome it. Don't fight for it and cling on to it forever. That's not, I don't think, is healthy. And I think what often happens is you get some people, male victims themselves and members of the public, that will say, well, do you know what? He didn't get hurt. Yeah, he didn't get hurt and he wasn't really traumatized by it. So they say, well, if a man rapes a woman, she will feel fear and she will be physically injured, or maybe there is more chance. That's what I'm saying. There is more chance. People will say there's more chance of a female victim of rape perpetrated by a man feeling lots of fear and having injuries. Okay. Now, I think some data and research says that may be true. However, it's not as if it's massively out of sync. It's not as if 99% of female victims of various forms of sexual abuse have all these issues and 1% of men do. It's, I don't think it's that out of sync.
Right.
But I think that the problem here for me is, but hang on a minute, are we saying then that if a victim, man or woman, if he is sexually abused, raped, assaulted by whoever, if that victim, man or woman, doesn't feel intense fear and suffers little injuries, are we saying it doesn't matter? Are we saying it's nothing? And often what you go is, but that's what it's like for men, but for women, but the reasons you've given, do you apply those reasons to women as well? And you get a silence, or you get a massive ideological response that makes no sense. But for me, I'm thinking, do you know what? It's about respect. It's about respect. And I've worked with guys where they have disclosed rape, abuse, all sorts of horrible things. And they've said, I didn't really feel scared. I didn't feel scared at the time and all. I felt uncomfortable. I felt awkward. I felt, I felt, I didn't look nice. Some have felt absolutely terrified, of course. Mm-hmm. But of the ones that said, look, she didn't hurt me and I didn't feel scared. I went, that does not mean that her or his actions were not illegal and abusive.
Well, to that point, I'll use myself as an example, right? Was I hurt physically in any way? No, not at all. Was I scared? Like, was I going in fear when it was going on? I can honestly say, not really. Confusion, misunderstanding. Why is this? That's what was going through my mind. I don't want this. Why is it happening? How do I stop it? That was what was going through mine. And I can see the difference where a woman would, one, legitimately be more afraid because obviously in general men are bigger. There's a bigger risk to her physically. But to your point, not to minimize that in any way, but it doesn't matter. It's ultimately about the person perpetrating the crime against the victim is asserting power over them. Right?
Yeah, and absolutely.
You'll hear that in terms of when men do it to women. But I can honestly say I don't think I've ever heard it in the reverse, unless, of course, I brought it up, and I'm sure you have. And they literally short circuit. You could see their brains short circuit when you mention that.
Absolutely.
I think that's what you were saying.
Yeah, I mean, like I say, it is about respect. I think men and women, I don't think it's as clear cut as, despite what some says, well, men have power and women don't. I think if we're going to go down the power route, I think it might be more accurate to say men have a certain type of power and women have a certain type of power, maybe, or advantage, and how that advantage or power can be used and manipulated is a different story, perhaps. But I think there's something about it, whether you felt intense fear or no fear at all, whether you had injuries or not, you were still abused. That is still wrong. That is still illegal. And it's about that respect. And I've had sort of guys and boys that have said to their wives, girlfriends, whatever, I said, no, I didn't want to do that. I told you no, I didn't want to do it. You weren't listening to me. I said no. And they go, oh, you enjoyed it, really? You got there in the end. I didn't hurt you, did I? And all of that. And they've said, well, yeah, but if it was the other way around, and, they get silence follows or awkward looks and things like that. Mm-hmm. And it's about respect. If you told me no, I'd stop. But I'm telling you no, you don't stop. Why do you think it's okay for you to carry on when I'm saying no, but I'm, but when you tell me no, I must stop because I will and I would. But why do you not think that's all right? And it's the whole, well, you're a man and that's different and I'm a woman. It's like, oh, hang on a minute.
Yeah.
How would you feel if I turned around and said, well, you're a woman and I'm a man and it means I can do what I want? Right. No. And I think coming back to the fear point, the fear for a lot of men sometimes comes after, because then it will be, hang on, now I'm scared because what do I do? Because if I say she did this to me, could she take the kids? If I say she did this to me, could she turn around and say, actually, no, he did it to me? And who are the police going to believe? This, little small stature of a woman who doesn't have as much strength as me. Mm-hmm. Are they going to believe her compared to me? Could she spin them a story? And this is another thing, sometimes with boys and men that have been abused, especially if it's by girls and women, there's the risk or the perceived risk of false allegations. And sometimes these can be a bit controversial. I don't think they should be controversial. I don't think, anyone who's worked with abused boys and men, whether it's sexually, physically, domestic abuse, both, whatever, will know that a chunk of female perpetrators can and do use the threat of false allegations to silence their victims.
When it comes comes to domestic violence, it's the number one way they keep the man silent. I'll tell them, it's, and I've worked with countless men that have told me that. I almost want to say, Phil, I don't want to say it's 100%, but it ain't far from it, where they've used that as that's their method of control. If you say anything, I'm going to tell them you did it to me. And as men, we know who they're going to believe,
Yeah, absolutely.
And, you made a point there that I just want to kind of touch on briefly, which is, you talked about fear later. And I think it's fair to say that I had a little bit of that. The one thing that I did, it was I tried to heal through alcohol. I mean, I started drinking at 13 because of it. And I was a raging alcoholic until I was about 23. And then I just stopped. And I'm fortunate that, I don't drink, but if somebody hands me a drink, I can have it and I won't relapse. I don't know why. I'm just a freak, okay? But I tried to mask my pain with alcohol. But it was also, and I want to get your opinion on this, because it created this situation where I didn't understand the sexual dynamic between men and women. I'm not sure how to quite phrase that. And out of the fear of not knowing what to do or what was right, I became very promiscuous, trying to find the answer. Does that make sense to you at all?
Yeah, I think for some people, from discussions I've had with other boys and men, there's something about, you look back and have this awareness or this perception that you believe you were not in control, or you didn't have the control that you think you should have had. So by initiating multiple different sexual experiences with multiple different sexual people, you may believe that you're regaining that control and you're now in control. And that to some degree makes sense. But again, it can be harmful behavior. And so then it would be, I think, as a therapist, it's useful to work with people to explore different types of control that you can get back.
Yeah. And that's what the therapy I went through, that's what we were doing, right, is trying to address that. It was very interesting. But again, I'm trying to bring these points up so that other guys can hear, I'm a 60-year-old man, I'm 6'1", I'm 280 pounds, talking about being raped, and people go, what? No, or domestically abused.
That's the thing. It's that idea that actually rape is this horrifically violent, terrible, awful, traumatic, violent, and it can be, of course, but it can be a little subtle than that. Under the heading of rape, there's all of these different diverse experiences. And I've worked with women where they, spoken to women that because, I felt uncomfortable. I didn't feel scared. I felt uncomfortable. It didn't hurt and I weren't injured, but I did say no, and I kept telling him no, and I kept saying no over and over and again. Well, again, that's not, no injuries, not intense fear, but it's still rape. It's still rape by the sort of legal definition, which we've touched upon.
Right.
But yeah, so there's all this sort of, this over exaggeration that all rapes are like this. Well, no, all rapes, all different types of sexual offences and different types of sexually abusive behaviour can go from minor to moderate to major, from small to large, from slight to severe. That's the thing. We see it with perhaps sexual harassment, which is often discussed in my experience in a way that exaggerates the problem, where certainly a boy or a man's behavior that is anything less than perfect he's deemed as a sexually harassing predator. But we don't ever do that with girls and women. We assume they're perfect. We don't need to tell them, and even if they do get something wrong, it's okay. And so I think, again, I touch on that in the book when I talk about what is the country, the UK doing to tackle the sexual abuse of boys and men. I kind of look at the police, education, social care, government, media, and how they're generally tackling the sexual abuse of boys and men. How they're generally tackling sexual abuse, but then how they tackle the sexual abuse of boys and men. And they either aren't or they're doing it poorly, in my opinion. And I give examples that highlight that, because when we talk about certainly the sexual abuse of boys, if we go back to 2009, and back then we had a Conservative government, they had guidance on tackling the sexual exploitation of children and young people. And whilst the guidance was far from perfect, it explicitly looked at the issues boys and young men face, and it will say why they perhaps don't disclose, why professionals find it difficult to engage in support work around male victims and things like that. And, it wasn't perfect, and there were some issues, but it made an attempt for boys. Now, fast forward over 10 years later, the guidance that we currently have really does not touch on boys and young men at all, except as perpetrators. And it does a lot more to talk about girls and young women as victims. So we've kind of regressed. I think we've gone backwards rather than forwards in that sense. But that's the thing, when you talk about the sexual abuse of boys and men, people sometimes assume you're talking about what perpetrators, them doing better for women, being better. It's like, no, hang on a minute, no. They can be abused and are abused, and there might be differences in how they perceive it and respond, but it doesn't mean it doesn't warrant attention. And the 5 things I often say, and my training is based all around these things, when it comes to the sexual abuse of boys and men. Boys and men, they are less likely to be identified as known or suspected victims. They are less likely to recognise that they are being abused or have been abused. They are less likely to disclose the abuse, and they are less likely to engage in services, and they are less likely to be taken seriously. And there is a wealth of data, research, reports, anecdotes, practice from experience, practitioners that support that. And the question is, what are we doing about that? Well, the answer is little to nothing.
And I want to kind of go down that path a little bit if we can, Phil. All right. So one of the things that I wanted to ask you, and this will lead us into what the UK is looking at or not doing. When you look at the prevalence of it, if you try and put a number to it, like how many, you'll often hear something like 1 in 4 women were raped, those type of things. But when you look at it for boys or men, I've seen things like 1 in 6. I've seen less than 10%. I've seen as high as 40%. I'm just off the top of my head spewing numbers, but knowing that you can't really put a hard number on it, but with your expertise, what would you speculate is a good guesstimate of that number? And the reason I'm asking, just so we can go from there, is I could see I'm trying to look at it from a political standpoint or a funding standpoint. If it is indeed, let's say, I've heard 3 and 5%. If it's 3%, okay, the amount of funding you're going to make available for that versus what if it's 40, whole other ball game. So that's why I wanted to ask you that. What is the prevalence, and if you can give us a little bit of an understanding on that?
So in chapter, I can't remember what chapter it is, but in one of the chapters of my book, I talk about prevalence, and I do basically what you've just said, where, well, actually, in the UK, this report says that report says this, the Crime in England and Wales survey says this says that says that says this. And then I talk about sort of data from the continents across the world and what they say as well. So I talk about the CDC in America and all of that. I think the problem is, I don't think it's 50-50, because to say everything is 50-50, it's exactly 50-50. Mm-hmm. I don't think, it's exactly like that. But I will say that I think it's a lot closer to 50-50 than we are led to believe. And so why do I think that? Well, we put huge amounts of funding and resources and initiatives and focus into developing campaigns into highlighting abuse against girls and women, encouraging girls and women to disclose, giving all the funding, or not all the funding, a lot of the funding to women's organisations. And you pick up a newspaper, look at the news. It's the message is all this horrible stuff's happening to girls and women. It's bad and it's terrible. They don't deserve it. We need to do something about it. So the message is it's happening to girls and women. It's bad. Let's stop it. Let's do something about it. I think there is significantly more encouragement going into encouraging girls and women to disclose than there is boys and men. Significantly more. And I'm fine with encouraging girls and women to disclose, absolutely. I'm not fine with little to no focus going into encouraging boys and men. And what seems to be happening is we look at the data from the Crime in England Wales survey and lots of other things, and it says, oh, well, look, there's this many girls and women that have disclosed rape and sexual assaults and so on. In the same period, look, this many boys and men have disclosed. And the assumption is, and this is what I debate with people, the assumption is, well, it's happening to girls and women more, isn't it? No, that's an assumption. Now, it might be a reasonable assumption. It might be an unreasonable assumption. Depends on what information you're using. But without adding an interpretation or anything or an assumption, factually what it means is girls are reporting it more, disclosing it more, which means it's being logged more. Just because and boys and men are not making those reports to the same level girls and women are. Now then, does that mean it's because it's happening to them a lot less? Or does it mean it's happening to them in similar-ish numbers, but they are less likely to report? I think it's that one. And the reason is because all you have to do, there's loads of reasons, but one is you go on social media and there are videos awash all over the place that show girls and women publicly and proudly hitting boys and men, kicking boys and men, spitting on them, hitting them with a brick, whacking them, hitting them on them with a frying pan. Also, there are various, I don't know what you want to call them, influencers, if that's the word, I don't know, where they will go into the street in London and various places and they will record people saying, so what do you think of women? What are women good for? What do we think of women? Oh, women are great, women are fantastic, they need all this support. And then they'll say, so what about men? And the speed at which these people slag men off and say they're terrible and horrible and they all want putting in cages is rapid. And I think, if that's how quickly these people are able to slag off and demonize the entire demographic of men quickly with enthusiasm and viciousness in their voice publicly on camera, what on earth are these people doing to some of these boys and men behind closed doors? And so if what they might be doing to boys and men behind closed doors could follow on from such an attitude that might influence harmful behaviour, well, then the question comes, well, those boys and men are not disclosing. Why would they, when we are constantly telling boys and men this constant vicious flow of you're bad, you're terrible, you're not good enough, we don't like you, you need to be better, you matter a lot less than girls and women. So why would they disclose?
It's an interesting point you just made, Phil, and I'm gonna kind of go to what's more my area of expertise, which is domestic violence. So back in the 80s and 90s, the paradigm was very much like we're talking about for sexual assault, rape right now. It's all women victim, male perpetrator. One of the issues that I remember talking about back when I was in a shelter is, how often do you ask men if they've been abused? 1. 2, do you ask them questions? So, what I started doing with men, that, people would come to me, or men would come to me, and I'd say, did she ever tell you you couldn't go see your family? Or did she ever tell you? And I had a whole list of questions. I still have it somewhere. It's like 15 questions. I will tell you truthfully, the number was damn near 100%. Right? Now, does that translate over to sexual assault, rape? I have no idea. I doubt you would know either. But I think some of the issue is that we don't ask, first of all, and we don't ask men the right way or boys the right way. You can ask a woman and she'll understand it because all the verbiage is geared towards women, I feel. Because, I'm translating from domestic violence side. Would you say that's a fair thing to say?
Absolutely fair, completely accurate, and I think there's research to back it up. There's literature that supports what you're saying. I've certainly experienced it with people I work with. Absolutely. I remember a few years ago, I was in a county that I won't name, and I was delivering training to a youth offending team. So a team of professionals who deal with young people who have committed crime and so on. And what they said very clearly was every single girl that is referred to their service is screened and assessed to see what is the risk of child sexual abuse and exploitation. Mm-hmm. They did not do it with any boys. It was standard that they did it with girls, but not with boys. So straight away, there's one example of, well, you're assessing it, you're finding things out with girls, you're not doing it with boys. Why not? Why not? And to me, that suggests, well, we care more about girls being abused than we do about boys being abused. And the problem is, and I could talk all day about this, I talk a lot about this in the book, that when boys, when boys or some boys are being sexually abused and exploited, the warning signs that they can display are often identical to the behaviours they display when they're involved in crime and drugs and youth offending. Mm-hmm. Problem is, professionals are much quicker to see and assume crime and drugs and youth offending, and a lot of boys and young men would rather be seen as young offenders than victims of abuse. And so actually we silently collude with that narrative. So these boys who are or may be being abused, youth offending services, for example, and there are some amazing ones, I will say, but some that are less amazing, they don't think of boys as sexually abused victims, so they don't ask the questions, they don't assess the risk, they're hidden, and so it's that unintentional collusion.
Right.
So we don't ask them, and the language is very, very important. As you've said, you ask an average guy, are you a victim of domestic abuse? They go, no. Okay, when you make a joke and your partner doesn't find it funny, has he or she ever slapped you around the face because of that really hard? Yeah. Okay. So again, the language needs to be less. It needs to be more straightforward, more simple, more basic, more say it how it is.
And that's the point. Yeah, right there. So you can be more ambiguous with women. They'll read between the lines. Men are cut and dried for the most part. I mean, obviously there's exceptions. I got to put the caveats in there, but in general, if you say to a man, did she ever take your phone away from it and go through it from you and go through it? Now, if a man does it to a woman, power control wheel says that's domestic violence. When she does it to a man, he's like, well, yeah, she's done that, but that's not abuse. She didn't hit me. And that's where having that conversation, I could see where it would directly translate over, because then you're creating a barrier for the victim to be able to understand that they're a victim, and then two, to get treatment. And that's something I want to kind of go into a little bit too, is how do we change all that so that we take these barriers down and help men realize, first of all, they are victims, and then get them to the help that they need?
Well, I think a lot of it is the language again, and I think with there's two words that I sometimes don't use with guys that I'm working with or I've spoken to, and that's counselling and victims. So they are by definition victims, and I'm providing counselling, therapy. However, I think the outcomes can be achieved without using the words. So, as you've alluded to before, a lot of men don't feel comfortable identifying as victims. They can't relate to the victim sort of language that's in the victim dictionary. And so it might be, I'm not sure about that. So often what I say to some boys and men is, what he or she did to you was illegal, it was bad, and it was wrong. And it's rather than saying you are a victim, you are this, rather than labeling them or giving them an identity based on what someone did to them, it's about saying what this person did that makes them abusive, that makes them a perpetrator, that makes them this. Let's kind of figure out how it's affected you. And some guys, and I wrote about this in my book, some guys, oh yeah, but me coming to counselling, isn't that's just really weak, isn't it? I went, well, do you know what? You don't have to call it counselling. We could just be two guys sitting in a room, having a cup of tea, having a chat, trying to figure things out. Now, that's just a very informal way of describing it. In my head, I'm going, yes, it's still counselling, and we have a therapeutic agreement that we sign and all of that sort of stuff. But if it helps him to engage with it by seeing it in that way, and it's all ethical and safe, then great. But it's what I often for me, helping guys get support. It's about sometimes reframing things around masculinity. So, and this is one of the big things that the book does that I won't say any others because I don't know, but I don't think many of the other books do this. My book talks about masculinity, or as Martin Seeger, child psychologist, talks about, it's archetypal masculinity and how we can use that to help abused boys and men overcome the abuse. So rather than demonize masculinity, use it. Rather than avoid it, grab hold of it, and so on. So, for example, if a guy says, "Oh, well, it's my wife forced me to penetrate her. It's really affected my self-esteem. I wish I'd have said something at the time, and now I'm in therapy and I'm just being." This is just really uncomfortable and I'm really weak because I can't deal with it. And I said, it's really interesting, validate, you'd empathize, you'd speak. And I said, and I'm wondering, could there be another way of looking at that? Because you're saying that actually coming here is weak and so on. But actually, what I'm also hearing is that you've made the decision to come here, even though it's very uncomfortable for you. And you've done that to take control of your situation, confront your issues and solve the problem, despite it being really difficult. Well, that doesn't sound like weakness to me. That sounds like strength. That sounds like you to take control. And the amount of guys that have really gone, oh yeah, I never thought of it like that. Or, oh yeah, I suppose it really helps them engage, explore things, talk. So it really, really does help. And I think, any national campaigns that we have, well, we don't really have any, but if we ever got to the point where the UK had some big national campaigns focused on male victims, I think that there is more chance of getting boys and men to respond to it, to disclose, to say something, if they avoided words like it's okay, terms like it's okay to be weak, it's okay to be vulnerable, seeking help is okay, you're a victim.
That would be the worst thing they could do.
And I think, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I think the problem with that is assuming that approach should work for men generally because it works with women generally. No, don't do that. And if we have an approach, take action, take control, tackle your problems, it means it shows strength, you're starting to regain control. And because it's all true. It's all true. It's just a different way. It's not like a lie or a manipulation. It's just reframing it and looking at it in a different way, not a right or wrong, just a different way to that. And so, I think that's what we need to do. And ultimately, when we talk about media, government, those sort of big high up things, I think they need educating and they need challenging. And I think, every month or so I see some commissioner that's put online something about implying girls and women, we should be safe, you've got the right to be safe, and so on and so on. Boys and men, you should stop being bystanders, talk to your friends, all of that. And again, it all leans towards boys and men, you need to be better, girls and women, we need to look after you. And I'm like, whoa, what are male victims who are being abused by their wives and girlfriends, who have been abused by their mothers or female teachers, who have been abused by any female in their life, or men for that matter? What are they going to think hearing all of this? I know what I'd think. I mean, well, I don't matter. I matter a lot less, so I'm just going to shut up. But we need to challenge it. And the more of us challenge it, the more that, that collective voice comes with strength. If somebody's online and making an inappropriate comment, then, and got to pick and choose what arguments you want to get into online, I guess. But any newspapers online that will print an article, comment and say that's not helpful, that's not accurate. If you read an article in a magazine online and it says, oh, well, he got an erection, so he must have enjoyed it, respond and say, actually, here's what the facts say. If government, if MPs, if people are saying things that promote this, must look after girls and women, and actually boys and men will treat you as if you're perpetrators, you need to be better, challenge that, explore that, encourage people to think about male victims who might be seeing that and how this narrative might affect them. So again, it's that challenge. I think we've got a long way to go, but as we've seen recently here in the UK, when we do challenge things and we do say, for example, I don't know if you've been following it, but we'd be great if in the UK we had a minister for men.
Oh,
The,
we can get in. I want to get into that a little bit
you know,
with you because it's funny. Well, let me just backtrack for a minute if that's okay. It's funny because you're talking about masculinity, right? And that resonates with me because one of the things that I do is I talk about my story. And the reason I do it is for exactly what you said. Is the more that I do it, the more comfortable other men will be and break down that quote unquote barrier of masculinity, which is often weaponized against us, by the way, to shut us up. A
absolutely, yeah,
common thing that is thrown at me is who hurt you, bro? And I'll get it from men and I'll get it from women.
yeah.
And it's designed to silence me, right? It's, oh, you're weak. You're pathetic that you even bring it up. No, I'm strong because I do that. And that's when I talk with people individually, when I talk in groups, and online. I make that point. No, the strength is opening up and sharing it. And more of us doing that will give us more strength.
Mhm.
And to kind of tie into now where I want to go, because you went there, you beat me to it, my friend, is there is this, I'll call it uproar in the UK about the Minister of Men, which, by the way, is mirroring something that happened about 10 years ago in the US. So under the Obama administration, they created, I forget the exact title of it, but it was essentially the Presidential Commission for Women and Girls. It was focused on women and girl issues. They didn't create one for men back then, right?
Mhm.
So for 10 years, it hasn't existed. I still fight for it. I'll bring it up, and they're blinders. They don't want to hear about it. So it's interesting to me to see that it is becoming, or has been now for a while, in the UK. Can you talk a little bit about what it is and where it's at? Because that, I do think people need to hear about that, not just in the UK and in the US, but I think this applies for any country because we do need to have some awareness of this.
Well, I don't think I wrote about this in my book, so this is a slight separation. But I think what was happening, and it's this has been brought up a few times in the UK, but in the last few weeks it's been talked about quite a lot, and it's been on TV and panel shows and everything. There are three MPs, members of Parliament. I think there's three, maybe there's four. I'm not sure, but a small number of MPs, men who believe that men have issues as well. There are some issues adversely affecting men. There are some issues that uniquely and disproportionately affect men. And so, why don't we have a minister for men? And why we, suggest one of those things. And Because they were very vocal about this, the news have got hold of it and they've kind of made it into this big thing. And there's been discussions on various news shows and panel shows and daytime TV shows and things like that. And from what I have seen, I've not seen everything, but from what I've seen, from what I've heard, from what I've read, the level of defensiveness and resistance
Mm-hmm.
to this suggestion is severely extreme. And I think I have a theory as to why. But it really is extreme, really severe. Some of the comments are just viciously horrible, and they, blow up misandry and all of that. The
Mm-hmm.
hatred of men is from there. I think a lot of the comments are, the vast majority of suicides are in men. The biggest killer of men under 50, I believe, is suicide. It's been like that constantly or steadily for quite a few years and so on. And often what happens is when people are saying this and goes, there's one big reason why we could do the minister for men. People go, no, we just need a minister for health, and it can be covered in that. I went, well, then what? Why would we need it? No, what the specific stuff? Why? We're not saying take anything away from girls and women. Absolutely not. No, I don't think I've heard anyone saying that. It's like, why can't we just have this event? And then you would get into the whole ideology where and what happens is the responses to these debates that you can be guaranteed to see one or two responses that go towards, let's divert away from the disadvantages experienced by boys and men, and we'll go on to how women have got it bad. Women have had it bad for
Mm-hmm.
years. Women
Mm-hmm.
are oppressed. Women have been abused. Women have been sexually harassed. The gender pay gap, which is an absolute myth, as economists have debunked over and over again. All of this sort of stuff. So again, it's like, hang on a minute. We're not saying women have got it easy. We're not saying women have got everything perfect. This is a specific discussion about getting a minister for men, not about what's going on with women. There is a minister for women. That's fine. That's great. They've got one, and that's nothing wrong with that. All great. But that's because there are issues uniquely and disproportionately affecting women. There are issues uniquely disproportionately affecting men. Women have got a minister. Why can't men have a minister? It's really why is it this difficult? So there's the whole no. Let's basically move the victim spotlight, or the disadvantaged spotlight, if you want to call it that, away from men, keep them in the dark, and keep it firmly on women and nobody else. The victim spotlight has got to be on women. It's their spotlight. They hog victimhood. That's the first thing. If they don't do that, what they then do, the second thing, is rather than give any time to focusing on how men are disadvantaged and have issues that adversely affect them uniquely / disproportionately, they'll go, no. What we'll do is, whilst the victim spotlight is away from men and on women, we'll now put another spotlight on men, and it's the perpetrator spotlight. Right, and this spotlight will go, men, you are perpetrators, oppressors, abusers, privileged, and so on. And what they often do is they take what a fraction of a percentage of men do and use that to demonize all men and go from there. And then those 2 points then come under the bigger heading of, well, the only harm that really should be addressed is harm that's experienced by one demographic perpetrated by the opposite. So it kind of peddles this really rigid gender binary. It's like, hang on a minute, no. Actually, the issues that men are facing, whether they're being perpetrated by other men, women, men and women, or no one, and it's just an issue, they're still issues that they are facing and are worthy of attention. And so that is what we kind of need to go down. And when a few weeks ago I was on a holiday on the Isle of Wight, and I got a phone call from Sky News, and they asked me to go on TV live and debate with someone the issue of not needing a minister for men. Now, my first comment was, well, I see what you're saying, but for me, it's not a debate. It shouldn't even be a debate. Why equality, fairness, the data, it shouldn't even need to be a debate. The vast majority of suicides, men, the vast majority of homelessness, men, the vast majority of homelessness deaths, men, the vast majority of workplace fatalities, men, the vast majority of people falsely accused, men, an issue we don't talk about, paternity fraud, victims, men, we can go on forever. So there's enough information there to say they need and deserve a minister. And I said, I'm not sure it's a debate. I said, however, can you tell me who I would be debating? And they went, we can't tell you that. I went, why? Well, we don't know yet. We don't know who it is. And I said, right, I'm not going to agree to something to debate with someone about this if I don't know who I'm debating, because there are certain people that I would never want to debate with because they're quite vicious. And I don't know if I think I want to engage in a reasonable debate. So can you let me know? And then, well, look, it's going to be at 8:30 tonight. Are you free? And I said, well, I'm actually not free. I'm looking after my little nephews and I'm busy, so I'm actually not free. Right, well, it doesn't matter then anyway. And I was left thinking, were you trying to get me involved in a debate live on TV without... And you weren't going to
I'll tell you right now what they were trying to do, Phil, because I've been trapped. They're trying to lay a trap for you. Right.
Well, a few people have said that, and I thought, do you know what? I don't know, and I thought actually the ideology, their bias. Are you wanting a fair debate, or are you coming at this? And I thought, do you know what?
Oh, they were going to set you up. Yeah, they were going to set you up. It's interesting what you're saying with all that because, again, I've been through similar things where I've been asked to come in and talk about it and debate it. Sometimes it's with another person. A lot of times you're walking into it might be a news program, and you're going against the moderator or the reporter or whatever, and they're loaded with information, right? And you're like, whoa, and they'll hit you with stuff out of left field. So one thing that I would say to people is we do need to welcome those debates when we can have them as adults. That's the way I put it, and reasonable debate. And you're kind of talking about, like in your case, MPs, I would say congressmen or legislators over here. One of the ways that I try and educate them is through things like your book, right? So I've gone in with 2 or 3 other guys, sat down with a legislator, and you have that conversation, but I'll have my backpack with me, and I might pull out a book that's specific to that conversation. So I would encourage people to get Phil's book and then go meet with your MP and say, we need to have a minister of men. For example, one of the things that needs to be addressed is sexual abuse of boys. Set the book right on the table. You might not think that that'll have a lot of power. Trust me, it will, because it adds to your credibility, right? You're bringing some expertise in, as opposed to the mistake most people make is they do this and you get too emotional and all that. It's a large part of driving this forward to get help for men, whether it's a minister for men in the UK or a presidential office in the US, is having that discussion with politicians. Because the media, in my opinion, is pretty much a lost cause at this point. I can't speak for the BBC, but I can tell you, NBC, ABC, CBS here aren't going to listen. They're just not. What I think and I'm encouraged by is things like this podcast. They're proliferating. They're getting the word out, and they are becoming the news. And that's why I think it's important to have someone like yourself on to talk about these issues, because it does raise awareness. Ultimately, it comes down to awareness, right? It's helping men, one, see that they're victims, as we talked about earlier, but two, to get the help. But in order to get the help, there's got to be somewhere for them to get help. Which leads to my next question for you, and I know you're going to speak specifically about the UK, but I'm virtually certain it's the same in the US. What is available right now in general? I mean, there's not much.
No, I don't. There isn't much. I mean, I think maybe that leans towards what's the best service provision, and sometimes do you have a male only service, or do you have a service that works with men and women that's accessible to males? And I think there's not that much research out there, as far as I'm aware, that says there's bits and there's some of it a bit contradictory and all of that. I think whether it is a male only service or you work with girls and when you work with males and females, you have to have that male friendly approach. Mm-hmm. That's the big thing. That's the key thing that you must have there, regardless. There's a few services here in the UK. There's the Mankind Initiative in Kent that work with male victims of domestic abuse. There's another Mankind Initiative, I think, is in Newcastle, that work with male victims. You've got Survivors in Manchester that work with male victims of sexual abuse. There's, I think, one in Brighton. There's in West Yorkshire, where I am, you've got Survivors. Survivors West Yorkshire. So there's a few, not many at all, and there's arguably a lot more. And I certainly know when it comes to child sexual exploitation services, there's significantly more services that work with just girls than just boys. But I think now what I'm seeing is you've got services, no, we need to work with girls and boys. We need to work with men and women. And I'm all for that, because it's an attempt to be inclusive, but I think some of them are not being inclusive in the right way. And their model of delivery that they use is they'll sit down, eye contact, talk about your feelings. It's okay to be vulnerable and ask for help and so on. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. And if that works with boys and men, fine. But if it doesn't, rather than assume there's something wrong with that boy or man for not engaging with that method, change your method and use male-friendly approaches, male-friendly language that's backed up by lots of literature and psychology that says, yes, use sort of action-orientated terms, taking action, taking control, do some shoulder-to-shoulder work rather than eye-to-eye, all of that. Give the boy or man something in his hands to move around if he's talking to you, so he doesn't feel as awkward. These are all general sort of male-friendly methods, and I write about these in the last couple of chapters of my book. But that's the thing, whether there's a few male-only services or whether the services that work with men and women, are they male-friendly? And I think I I won't name anywhere, but I know of services, and I've seen them online, where they'll go, we work with male victims, we work with female victims. They are significantly a lot more vocal when it comes to raising awareness of female victims, tackling female victims, all of this sort of stuff. I know of one organisation that used to work with just girls that were victims. They got a bit of funding to work with boys, and but they were not vocal. They weren't looking at the issues of that predominantly affect boys. And I tell you now, you tell somebody, or you say to them, do you think you could maybe incorporate elements of masculinity and use elements of masculinity in your practice to help boys and men engage? Again, you get a lot more reluctance and resistance than you do people thinking, maybe I'll think about that. And again, it's like, oh my God, you've said the M word, masculinity. That's bad. Oh, hang on a minute. No. And I'm going, why is it bad? It's not bad at all. And so I think for me, whether it's a male-only service, a service working with males and females, it has to have that accessible practice. It has to be inclusive. It has to, for me, make an effort in addressing the issues that uniquely and are disproportionately experienced by boys and men, especially if they do that with girls and women.
Well, I think you're bringing up a point that I've made. It's very similar when you look at sexual exploitation or abuse or any of that. When you look at it from domestic violence, they're so similar. And one of the issues with domestic violence is the messaging to men, right? There are shelters out there that will cater to men and women, but they don't message that they do. Or if they do, they message it in a way that would get a woman's attention, but not a man's. You talked about face-to-face versus shoulder-to-shoulder. I was recently, a couple of times I've talked with psychologists, and I've had that specific discussion because when I talk to guys, I'm not a therapist, I'm not licensed, I don't claim to be any of that, but I don't talk to them face-to-face. If I'm meeting with them in person, it's off to the side, like you said, or you find some activity, golfing. Let's go hang and do whatever. That takes that barrier down. Whereas women are more apt to open, in my personal opinion, and maybe you as an expert can say that, women are more apt to open up to face-to-face. Men will shut down. And I personally am that way. But it begs the question, we know that, you and I know that. How do these experts running these things not know that? Because, and I've asked that question in domestic violence scenarios, is how do you not know that? You have more training than I do, but yet you can't seem to understand it. Me as a layman get it. Why? And they never answer me.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I think to some of these bodies, organizations, whatever you want to call them, they do know this. But they ignore it. It doesn't fit their narrative. And I think, the idea of giving masculinity any good press goes completely against their narrative. And that's the narrative they do not want to be destroyed. They want to preserve this rigid narrative, masculinity is bad, masculinity is toxic, or masculinity can be bad and can be toxic, and all of, and so there is that. I think those who are not aware of this, but then become aware of it, it's just maybe about encouraging them to go, look, just think about this, read what the literature says, read what is out there and what kind of goes on. Recently I'll pick my words carefully, an association that is very much concerned with mental health was presented with very clear, robust information about the male-friendly ways of working, the male-friendly methods that help boys and men engage. And, from what I read, my opinion is that they just dismissed it and just said, nah, it doesn't really fit. They didn't say that, but that's kind of reading in between the lines, my interpretation. I'm thinking, how can you be so dismissive of this? It's right there. And so I do wonder what's the agenda here. And I'll be honest, years ago, I think I might have said this to you before, I'm a bit embarrassed to say, but years ago when I first started working with boys and men, and they didn't engage in that feelings, emotions, softly spoken. It's okay to be weak and vulnerable and ask for help. They weren't engaging with that sort of approach.
Hmm.
And I did think toxic masculinity, that's not great. These, they're not ready for therapy and all of that. But it wasn't that there's something wrong with them. The problem was with me. The
Hmm.
problem was with me assuming that because that approach generally worked with the female clients that I was seeing, that it should work with the male clients. And for some, it did. But I thought I need to adapt my approach.
Right.
And I started to adapt things and be more action orientated. And I started to see that it worked, but I thought I'm doing something bad by doing this. I'm going against my core training.
Hmm.
But a lot of the core training out there that talks about that trains you to be counselors or like psychotherapists doesn't look at the differences between what males on average prefer and females on average prefer. It just uses this and goes, this is how you do it. Well, no, we need to be more flexible. And then when lots of psychological literature started being published and I started to read it, it backed up what I was already doing and it gave me more tips to do more. And I thought, I am doing this right. This
Hmm.
is the right thing to do because it's backed up by the literature. And coming back to your point, there is I don't know if it's, I think it was it a study or a research paper that was in, I can't remember. Basically, a number of therapists, counselors were interviewed. I think this is in 2014. And they were basically saying that um, women wanted to come to therapy, sit down, express their emotions and talk about the feelings. Men, in general, on average, wanted to come and wanted plans, actions, and
Right.
solutions.
How are you going to
And
fix it? Yep.
exactly.
Yep.
And I think the problem is that, and I've had it, with people I supervise. Oh, isn't it bad that, how do I fix things? I've got to fix this thing. I've got to solve the problem. Isn't it bad that that's what they want? And I'm like, no, why is it? Because if the method that you are using to get to a positive outcome for that boy or man you're working with, if the method is safe, it's one they want, it's ethical, it's not harmful, and it contributes towards a positive outcome, why does it matter that it wasn't the same method you
Right.
use for girls and women you're seeing? Why? But a lot of the counselling courses, certainly in this country, they not all of them, but some of them have this view that, oh no, just sit and be with those emotions and experience them. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. There is something wrong with assuming that should work for everyone you
Right.
see. That there's no difference between what your average male and your average female want, or more accurately, I should say, what females want on average versus what males want on average. And that's the thing. But all of the literature that's now coming out, there's more, it's like, yeah, that backs up, that backs up, that backs up, yeah, all makes sense, all of that. And if women are saying, well, we kind of generally want this, and men generally want this, give it to them. What's wrong with that? And it works. And I've adapted my practice over the last 10 years or so significantly, and I've seen the results. And if it didn't work, I won't keep on doing it and I won't be singing it about it. I'd be abandoning it, but it works.
Yeah, it's interesting what you're talking about there because I know someone who's a mental health professional. She's a therapist of some, I don't know her degree, but I was having a similar conversation with her, and she said, "Dan, there's something you need to understand. Psychotherapy right now is run by women. The training is run by women. So I forget the exact number, but essentially something like 90% of therapists under the age of 30 are female. I think overall it's like 3 to 1, somewhere in that area, our female to male ratio. And she
Yeah.
said they aren't training these people how to help men because they don't understand how to do it. They they and it's she wasn't faulting them per se in the sense that they're women trying to take what they know through their training, but also as women, is what she was saying. What would
Mhm.
work for me personally, well, that's going to work for everyone. So we're going to follow that paradigm, which is what you're essentially saying. And to your point, she said it's not going to work with men. And that's why she's like, if we don't change this, men are already turned off by therapy in general. It's going to only get worse. I just want to get your thoughts on what she was saying and how you feel about
I
that.
agree with it. It makes sense. I mean, I think the evidence is out there. It's out there. It's in the books. It's in the literature. It's in the research. There's been reports. Universities have done reports. At Leeds Beckett University here a few years ago, they replicated these findings as well. And I think, people I work with, I supervise, and my practice, I see that it works with these boys and men. If it didn't work, then I wouldn't carry on doing it. And I'm a private practitioner. So when people come and they pay me for my time, then, from a business model, and obviously any hard cases, it's not all about the money, of course, but I'm a private practitioner. I need to earn money to pay my bills like everybody does. Then I guess there's something about, well, if I wasn't getting client referrals, if people were not coming to me, engaging with me, then I wouldn't keep using a method that didn't work. I wouldn't do, not just from a business point of view, but also from a mental health effective outcome point of view. I wouldn't keep doing it. Why would I? It has no benefit to me whatsoever. If all of the research and my experience says, no, men don't want to fix their problems, men don't want to find a solution, that most men on average want to just sit and talk about how they feel. And many do. And I find that actually a lot want to sit and talk about how they feel with the element of solutions and actions and problem solving as well. But they don't, in my experience, they don't want just the feelings and the emotions. They want that with the other side, which is fine. But if that didn't work, or even worse, it had harmful consequences, then I won't keep doing it. I'd stop it. But it does, and week by week I see it. I remember one guy, and before him says, I have his permission to share this. He was basically assaulted in the workplace, and he didn't think he was a real man, and we had to explore, what does being a real man mean, and we explored all that and everything. And he went, well, I'm weak because this person punched me and legged it, and I'm really, really weak. And I've gone, but hang on a minute. I says, what I'm hearing there, let me just reflect this back to you. I says, what I'm hearing is that you're in a situation and this person is having a go at you, he's squaring up to you, he's been verbally abusive. And then all of a sudden, when he sees an opportunity for him to have a quick getaway, without you realizing, without you seeing it coming out of the blue, he suddenly punches you and then legs it. He didn't punch you and then carry on punching you. He didn't punch you and carry on fighting you, did he? Now, do you think that maybe he punched you and legged it because you're weak, or because he saw you as strong and a threat? And his face just dropped.
Mine just dropped too, because you just you kind of hit home with me. Right.
And but what you'll get is some people going, oh, that's really bad, because you just need to encourage me. It's okay to be weak. It's all right to be vulnerable. And I went, yeah, I know it is, but he doesn't want to hear that. And what benefit is it going to bring to him by telling him that? I'm not saying you're a big, strong, tough man and everyone in the world is scared of you. I'm saying in this particular situation, maybe there's a way that you could look at this, that you haven't looked at it. And we're bringing in sort of subtle elements of masculinity. That helped him see it from a completely different point of view, and that caused him to feel differently. And so again, what's the harm? There's no harm. If we're just sitting there, oh yeah, it sounds like it's really difficult for you. Yeah, you're really beating yourself up there. Yeah. And I can really hear that, there's all this anxiety and there's this worry, and how do you see yourself and all that? And it sounds like it's really, really tough for you. I'm just, again, and I think that's sometimes, the mistake a lot of people make. They over rely on empathy. Now, empathy is important and it matters. Of course it does. In my experience, a lot of practitioners over rely on that. And then you get boys and men going, look, I'm seeing all these people, but they're just repeating back to me what I'm saying using slightly different words. What's that about? Yep, that's called an empathic reflection.
Or that's famous saying that I hate. How does that make you feel?
Well, that's the other thing as well.
I hate that phrase.
For me, somebody who's very good at empathy should not need to ask that. If I'm sitting opposite a guy and he says to me, for example, my wife told me she would be home at 6 o'clock. She wasn't home at 6. She rolled up at 7 o'clock. She didn't text me. She didn't phone me. She didn't tell me where she was. This is the 5th time she's done this month. I shouldn't need to be asking him how he feels for me to get sense of how he feels.
I just told you how I feel. Why are you asking me how I feel? I literally just told you. I actually said
Exactly.
that to a therapist because she was a wonderful person. I'm not, but she was doing what you said. I was talking. Here's what happened. Blah blah blah. And I'm getting this just like you're doing right now, making her notes,
Yeah.
and then she's doing her empathy thing, and then she looks. Well, how does that make you feel? And I exploded. I did, and I was wrong of me to do that, but I'm like, I literally just spent 15 minutes telling you how I feel. How do you not know? I never went back to her after that because, again, I take some of the blame for that too. I should have realized she was trying to draw out of me, and now that I look back at it, but she didn't know how, maybe to be fair to her, she didn't know how to, right? She was, like you said, the training that she had was leading her there, but it was just like, I'm getting fired up even thinking about it right
Well,
now.
one of the things I often say to guys who are looking for a therapist, I said, well, what do you want from a therapist? What do you want? Or perhaps more interestingly, what do you definitely not want? And they might say, well, I want plans, I want actions, I want solutions. Right, okay. And what do you definitely not want? Well, I don't mind empathy. I mean, they don't word it how I'm wording it to you, but they
Hmm.
basically, I don't mind empathy, but I don't want just empathy. I went, right, tell them that. So if you go online, you find a therapist there, you can afford them, they're close to where you live, you like look at them and all that. Then before you book an appointment, just say, look, this is what I'm after. I want this, but I don't want this. Is that something you can do? And if the therapist says, no, 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 I work in a purely, I'll focus on your emotions and all of that, and I won't go to plans and solutions and all that, then maybe that's not the right person for you. But and again, I think helping someone with plans and actions and solutions and fixing problems, that's not a bad thing. It's not telling them what to do. It's just working with them in a slightly different way and using different language.
Begs a question I have for you, Phil. Is do you, in general, obviously there's exceptions. Do you find men respond better to male therapists than female?
I think that's an interesting one. Again, there's conflicting reports on this. Some say, men want a female therapist. Some say they want a male therapist. Some say, you should always offer a male client, a male or a female therapist. You don't always have that option. It varies, and I think it depends on who they are, their background, and all of that.
Hmm.
Um, I have certainly seen in recent years, from my own experience, more men explicitly wanting a male therapist
Hmm.
because that's, in my experience, that's because they've seen a female therapist and they used all the emotional, heavy, focused approach, which they didn't want.
Right.
Um, or the female therapist used words and terminology that the guy found problematic, i.e., well, do you know what? That's probably your toxic masculinity speaking there, or because how do you think we can use your male privilege to help you overcome the abuse?
Or your internalized misogyny.
Yes, we do. Well, we do live in a patriarchy, and I guess you are part of that patriarchy.
Yeah.
So,
Oh.
I'm like, what? What? How on earth is it? What? No,
Yeah.
no. And again, I think a lot of the guys walk away thinking anti-male, hatred of men, contempt for men, women are here, men are here, and actually, maybe if I see another man, that might be the right thing. However, there are male practitioners, not just therapists, that also have these
Right.
views
Right.
as well.
Right.
But I think they often find that if I'm a safer bet with a guy, and so I think it really depends. For me, I don't think it should matter whether you're a man or a woman. It's about, do you have a male friendly approach? And when I did my training, I say, you know what, if you're seeing boys and men and you think, well, actually they're a bit deficient, they're not great, but I'll help them, and they need to be better generally, and that all their masculinity is toxic, or they're all part of the patriarchy, male privilege. If you genuinely believe that, it's worth wondering how those views might influence your practice. They might not. You might be able to keep it totally separate.
Right.
I would encourage people to explore those views anyway. I think in a world that where I think in a world where men are given significantly harsher prison sentences than women for the same and similar crimes, and we have what's going on in Ukraine and Russia, where men are breaking their arms to get out, being forced to fight in war, and men have been prevented from fleeing war-torn countries. I have no idea how anyone could logically say that we live in a patriarchal world where that's going on. I think it's just more accurate to say that there are disadvantages affecting women and there are disadvantages affecting men, and let's not
Right.
compete for victims again. But yes, I think so. Yeah, it's about saying to guys, look, tell the therapist what you want, what you don't want, and don't be afraid to do that. And if you think someone is displaying misandry or subtle forms of it, then you're in charge, and you can either explore that with a therapist and say, "You said that. What do you mean? What's going on there?" But you can vote with your feet, as lots of people do, and think, right, well, I'll find someone else who doesn't have those views because I don't want to hear those views, and it makes me wonder how you perceive me and all of that. So yeah.
Yeah, it's funny because when I talk to guys, they're like, "Yeah, I'm not doing therapy," or "I tried it and I'll never go back," and all that. And I always, the way I phrase it is comfort. You need to be comfortable with them. Because without comfort, you're not going to build trust. And ultimately, to me, that's what it comes down to. You're sharing your deepest thoughts, feelings, emotions. You need to trust that that person is going to be there for you to guide you, however you want to phrase it, and help you along, as opposed to putting up those walls like, wow, that's your internalized misogyny talking. And when I talk with guys, because I can only help them to a certain point. I'm basically a sounding board, nothing more. But I will say to them, look, you're now I just did this with someone earlier this week. I cannot help you. It's not that I don't want to. I'm not trained. I will help you find a therapist. So, we're working on that now, because it's finding that right therapist. It may be a man or woman. I asked you that question. My belief in general, and this is my layman's personal belief, men are more comfortable with men, and it may not be right to think that way. I think it's more a case of, like you were touching on, that the women are more inclined, or more of a risk that they're going to throw something like the patriarchy at you. So, but the thing I want to kind of put the bow on that is to say to men, if you have a bad experience, don't let that stop you from getting help.
Yes.
Get out, and you may have to go through 10. I went through 8 or 9, to be honest with you. And some of them I was with for 4 to 6 months, and then I'm like, this is going nowhere, right? And it wasn't until I found one that really wasn't a highly trained one. And the guy he's like, look, dude, sit down. At one point, he's like, you gotta stop playing the victim, basically, and deal with this shit. Because that's the thing. For me, it was, I kept going around it, right? And they could never dive in because I didn't have that connection. With him, I built that connection, and he was able to call me out on my shit, as I call it, right? And that's what got me over the hump. That's what works for me. It may not work for anybody else.
Exactly. And again, I think within that, there's something about how does the therapist work? And if you want a therapist that's more challenging than some, say that. If you want someone who's not as challenging, that's fine. But I think there's also something about the therapist has got to be clear how they work. And it might be that they say, right, this is me, this is who I am, this is what I can offer you, this is how I work. Does it sound like something you can work with or not? And then you can go, yep, or no, or we'll give it a go. I can be quite challenging, but I say to clients that I see in the very first session, I can be quite challenging. That challenge can look like this, it can be like this. If you don't like the challenge, tell me and we can talk about it. But therapy is generally quite challenging. It's just that I'm usually quite direct and challenging with that. And this is how I work, this is what I do. If someone says to me, actually, Phil, can you change how you work a bit? Because I want this, whatever that is. If I think I'm, skilled enough to do that, then I'll go, yeah, okay, I will give that a go, I'll try it. If I'm not, then I'll go, yeah, I can't do that, or I don't work, that's not like me, maybe we're not a good fit. And that's fine, have those honest and frank conversations. But I do think, as I said, the point I'm making earlier is I do think a lot more therapists, and not just therapists, any professionals that are involved in the one-to-one help support industry, if we call it that, needs to know a lot more about sort of male-friendly methods of working, and rather than just ignoring it, it just beggars belief that we don't do more about that.
Well, what's interesting is I can relate this to another analogy that might work for the men in the audience. Is think about how you'd want to be coached. Whether, let's say it was the real football, not soccer, sorry, or as a personal trainer. If I'm being trained, like when I was in powerlifting and all that, I want a coach that's going to yell at me, like literally scream at me. That's what I want. Yet, when I coach others, in 40 years of coaching, not on a football field, but weightlifting or something like that, I coached mostly women. I can count on one hand how many I quote unquote was told to yell at, right? It's just being able to adapt to it and find the person that can fit what you want. It's what you're saying, right? So maybe for somebody that's listening that doesn't quite can't put the connection as far as therapy, think of it that way, right? Is how would you want a trainer to coach you? Or on a football field, I was a screamer as a coach. That's because that's what I wanted and it worked, right? But that's different than a personal training session or therapy. Find someone that fits what you want and have the key point you made, I think, is have a conversation with them about what you want. Because ultimately,
Absolutely.
it's
Yeah.
to your benefit.
And if you don't know what you do want, start off by maybe saying what you definitely do not want.
Right.
And that might lead into a conversation that might naturally flow into what you do want. But this is all about you. It's about kind of looking at you and focusing on you. So there's nothing wrong with saying what you want. When I see guys, in fact, when I see sort of women or guys, and they sit in front of me and they'll say, "I want to be challenged," I think, yes, this is someone who's ready, is willing to really go there, do the difficult stuff. And generally, I find that most of those people that say that get something useful out of it. And I'll say, right, I think you've come to the right person. I went, please tell me if my challenge is a bit too much, and we'll talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
It has rarely happened because you gauge the person you're working with and you get a sense of how far you can and can't go.
All right, we only have a few minutes left, Phil. So I want to ask you the one question I have down here in big bold letters, which is,
Okay.
as the author of the book, if I'm coming to you and I'm going to ask you, what is the number one or two takeaways that I would get by reading your book? What are the two things that you would want me to take away?
Right, I would say it was a very good question. So,
Got you thinking, didn't I?
yeah, you've got me there. So, I think two that come. I mean, there's probably a few, but two that immediately come to mind. Maybe three that come to mind
Okay.
is there are that perhaps you now have a greater awareness of just how severe and prevalent the disadvantages and gender biases are when it comes to working with and dealing with the abuse of boys and men. That boys and men are sexually abused a lot more than we realize.
Mm-hmm.
And that masculinity can absolutely be used to help boys and men overcome their abuse.
I love it. How can they get the book, Phil?
So, I'm so naive. So here we were like Amazon.co.uk.
Amazon, yeah.
I did not realize I'm so naive. There's an Amazon.co.uk, but there's also an Amazon.com, which, as I'm saying this out loud, I'm thinking, well, Phil, of course there is, because there's got to be. But I didn't realize that because I'm just pretty stupid.
It's two different things, though.
Yeah. Didn't realize. So you go to Amazon, just Google the sexual abuse of boys and men book. It's one of the first ones that comes up. It's relatively affordable. I think it's out on Kindle as well, so you can get the hard the actual copy or the Kindle. So it's on Amazon, and I'm not sure if it's on Barnes and Nobles. Yeah, I'm not checked, but it's certainly on Waterstones, which is the main bookshop we use here. So yeah, it's on there, and please feel free to have a look.
Well, I will put links down in the show notes so they can go get the book.
Okay.
I'll make it as easy as I can for you guys. Phil, any final thoughts?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think that I just hope people find it useful, and the first chapter of the book, or the second chapter, talks about my own experience of abuse, and I had to kind of be a little bit, do I really want to talk about me? And coming back to what your therapist said to you, stop being the victim.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, yeah, I don't want to be a victim. I don't want to bathe in victimhood. I don't want to identify as this, eternal angry entitled victim person. I think there's too many of that much mentality out there, and it's not helpful. It's bathing in victimhood rather than overcoming it. But I thought, actually, if I share it, it's out there, it's done, and hopefully someone will read it and get something useful from it, then that's fine. And so I have done that. But I think one of the other things I will just say is chapter 7 of the book, I believe, it talks about how society treats boys and men. So it's the whole nature versus nurture argument. So chapter 8 looks at we talked about earlier on, sort of abused boys and men getting erections, what happens in your brain, different sort of average sex differences between the brain of males and the brain of females, and how that plays a part or can play a part in sexual abuse. But the chapter before that, so that looks at nature, whereas a chapter before that looks at nurture, like upbringing, society, environment. And I think whether you are interested in reading about the sexual abuse of boys and men, chapter 7 basically looks at all of the disadvantages, issues relating to misandry, hatred of boys and men, all the anti-male narrative. It talks about how it affects boys and men and male victims. But I think if you're interested in issues affecting boys and men and just, Minister for Men and all that, that chapter alone would probably be useful for people to read as well.
And I would encourage people to get the book, whether it's for yourself. If you're a mom or a single mom, you should get the book and read it so you have a better understanding of what your son might be going through, or God forbid has to go through, right? I don't wish this on anyone. The more we can read and understand each other, the better off we all are. That's my take on it. One final thing to ask you, Phil, is I gotta have you. How do people follow you on? I'm gonna call it Twitter. I know it's X, but it's Twitter, because I follow you there, and there isn't a day goes by I don't go looking for your stuff. So I want I want everyone to go follow you. How can they do that?
Well, you just find me on Twitter, Phil Mitchell 83. That's me, and sometimes I tweet a lot, sometimes I don't tweet too much, and I've certainly learned, sometimes through bitter experience, I will say, to pick and choose certain tweets to comment on, and I what I try to do now is, if there is a point that I disagree with, or a point that I think contributes towards this bigger narrative that is very harmful to boys and men, very anti-boys, anti-men, well, rather than, depending on who the person is and lots of other factors to consider, I might not comment on that person's tweet, but I will take what that person has tweeted and I will post my own tweet to say, I've just seen this online. It says well, I think and I don't agree with that, because I think that's just a different way of addressing the point rather than the person, because you end up in a big back and forth for days and days and days arguing where you never get anywhere. You're never going to agree with each other's point of view, and so it's sometimes a waste of time. But I think the more people that see something and go, I can relate to that, they share it, it goes out there, and we spread the word that way. So I'm trying to do that now. But yes, Phil Mitchell 83, if anyone does want to follow.
Go follow Phil, because, and I will say this for you, you're doing it to educate and raise awareness. It is obvious on your Twitter. I've been known to feed the trolls once in a while, because, one, I'm in a better position than you. You're professional. You have to be careful with something. Let's be honest about it. But me, when I feed the trolls, I know I'm not going to change their mind, but I get others to see their mindset and go, whoa, and
Absolutely.
And I share things of yours. I know you've shared things of mine. So you get the best of both worlds. You get both of us if you follow either one of us. So follow us.
There you go.
All right.
There you go.
Phil, I do want to say thank you for coming on again. And I encourage everyone to go get that book. Like I said, I will put links in the show notes. Follow Phil on Twitter. I truly appreciate you as a human being. And I want to say, as a victim, I appreciate the work you're doing. It resonates with me. It means a lot to me. Even though mine was 40 whatever years ago, I still am affected by it. And you are helping me. And I want you to know that, because
really appreciate it.
I really mean that too, because it's tough for men. It's, women have tough, men have tough. It's a little different. We kind of talked about that during the show, but the more men like you that speak up and help men, and women for that matter, the better off we all are. The better off society is. So I want to personally thank you for the work that you do.
Oh, well, that's really nice to hear. Thank you. I really do appreciate that. Thank you very much.
All right, Phil. On that note, we're going to go ahead and wrap things up. Hey, if you've watched this far, do me a favor. we're trying to spread the word. This podcast is about education, right? We just did a whole discussion on, unfortunately, sexual abuse of men and boys and what they go through in various topics along those lines. We want to help educate people, just like what Phil's trying to do, what I'm trying to do. The best way you can help me to do that is to like this, share it, comment on it. Let me know, and I know Phil will read some of the comments too. Let us know what you thought. Good, bad, or indifferent. I don't care if but I don't agree with you on that. That's okay. Let's have a conversation. Now, keep it respectful, all right? Let's not get into the insult. But the more conversation we have, whether you're man or woman, we all benefit from it. And that's another takeaway that I would give to people is the reason for this podcast is to hopefully get some dialogue going, because right now we're too fractured as by gender, politics, all of that. And if we can help raise awareness of what each other's going through and have conversations, we all benefit from it. So like, share, and of course, subscribe, because this podcast comes out every Sunday at 11. I have different topics each week, different people on. I have experts such as Phil on. I have guys that come on and share their stories. Again, it's all about raising awareness. And one other thing real quick to mention is I'm also live on YouTube and on TikTok Wednesdays, 4 to 5:30 p.m. Eastern. And sometimes we talk about topics like this. I open it up, and sometimes people will open themselves up, or through that they'll reach out to me and I can get them to help. So join me there as well. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next week on Men Need to Be Heard.